So my name is Debbi Long, and I'm going to talk to you about unlearning how to not know. I'd like to acknowledge the Yuin people of South Coast New South Wales, in so-called Australia, as the traditional owners of the unceded country from which I'm speaking to you. I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and First Peoples listening to this talk. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank PermaQueer for the groundbreaking work they're doing and for inviting me to be part of this really exciting event. So, unlearning how to not know. Here in Australia, as in all colonised and colonising societies, we're taught the value of education. A Western education teaches us many things. What I'd like to talk about today are some of the things that a Western education teaches us not to know. In her talk, Aloha is Our Intelligence, Indigenous Hawaiian academic Professor Manu Maya talks about Hawaiian epistemologies. So epistemology means a system of knowing. Professor Maya tells us not to be scared of the word epistemology. She says it's a great big word with a little piss in the middle of it. Permaculture is an epistemology. It's a whole interconnected system of knowing. Western scientific understandings of the world are an epistemology, a knowledge system. Western scientific knowledge is based on a number of practices, one of which is observation, where you observe the world around you. So far, sounds a lot like permaculture. Unlike Western science, though, a permaculture approach to observation, as with everything, embraces complexity. So permaculture tells us to observe, then observe some more, and observe more, and observe a little bit more, and then keep on observing. Now, what happens when you do this is that you come up with answers like, yeah, a thingamy-bob tree will grow best in a sheltered, sunny spot unless there's XYZ mineral in your soil, in which case it likes less sun, or unless your block is susceptible to the, those whatchamacallit bugs, in which case a bit of breeze will protect it better, or unless you're Kathy and John, whose thingamabob tree grows on the southern side of their house, gets winter frosts, and yet it's got the best fruit you've ever tasted. Now, a Western scientific approach tends to reject this type of complexity and fuzziness. Western science likes simplified black and white answers and is deeply uncomfortable with shades of grey. This is often referred to as a reductionist approach, where you reduce or limit the number of variables you're comparing in order to get more definitive, more concrete answers. So Western science likes things to belong to one category and not to the other. Western science is particularly fond of binary categorizations, where things are on either end of a spectrum. Western ideas of the world often reduce the multidimensional continuums that we inhabit to simpler two-dimensional binary categories. Scientific ways of understanding the world are deeply rooted in hierarchy. They were developed in Western-style societies, which were very unequal. Some of the population were incredibly wealthy, and their vast wealth and abundance came at the cost of other parts of the population, who were left impoverished with an unequal share of food and the necessities of life. It's no wonder that a society that had such an unequal distribution of resources developed a system of understanding of the world that helped justify that inequality. So scientific knowledge, it's reductionist, it's fond of binaries, and it's hierarchical. Western knowledge also has a very particular idea about what it is to be a human being. Western science is deeply invested in human superiority. Human beings are supposed to be superior to plants, to animals, to anything else on the planet. And the so-called Age of Enlightenment, where Western science was being developed, some types of humans were regarded as more worthy than others. Men, white people, rich people. Those types of people are seen as better than or more deserving than other types of people. Now, in order to uphold the idea that some people are more worthy than others, human beings needed to be made separate from each other. The things that connected us to each other and to the rest of the planet needed to be downplayed, and separation needed to be emphasised. The idea of individuality, of independence, came to be valued as being part of being one of the superior dominant humans. There are many cultures in the world who see the idea of independence as a type of insanity, that it's insane to imagine that a human being can exist without other human beings. One of the very essences of being human is our connection. But Western scientific knowledge formed an idea of human beingness in which independence and disconnection from other people, from other species, from the planet was a preferable way of being. Now, in order to be able to believe these things, in order to be able to believe in disconnection and separation, there's certain things that Western science needed us to not know. It needs us not to know how connected we all are. It needs us to not know how vulnerable we are when we are individual and separated. It needs us to not acknowledge vulnerability, because vulnerability implies dependence, and seeing ourselves as dependent might make us less than human. Feminist philosopher Nancy Chuana talks about epistemologies of ignorance, the knowledge that we deliberately need to be ignorant about in order for our worldview not to be under threat. In order for a patriarchal world to celebrate male superiority, we need to be kept ignorant of women's achievements and capabilities. In order for a white dominant society to celebrate white superiority, we need to be kept ignorant of skills and abilities of people of colour, and we need to be ignorant of history. This is particularly true in terms of food security and land sovereignty. In her famous TED talk, The Danger of a Single Story, Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie quotes Palestinian poet Marid Barghouti as saying the simplest way to dispossess a people is to tell their story, but start it from the second place. Start with the bows and arrows of First Nations peoples in America, and it's a very different story to when you start from the arrival of the British to Turtle Island. Adichie says, start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. Similarly, starting Australian history with Terra Nullius and the myth of peaceful settlement has allowed us to ignore frontier wars and massacres, to remain willfully ignorant as a nation of the impact of intergenerational trauma, systematic structural racism, and types of resource discrepancies that have resulted from generation after generation of Anglo-Australian white privilege. German philosopher Hegel talked about master-slave relationships. One aspect that he wrote about is the false idea that so-called masters are more knowledgeable than the people whose lives they control. In actual fact, it's more frequently the other way around. Because the lives of dominated people are vulnerable to the whims of the so-called masters, a subjugated people will be aware of every mood shift, every preference, every aspect of the dominators' lives, because their own very existence depends on this knowledge. Oppressors don't need to have detailed knowledge of the lives that they control. This type of structural ignorance permeates decision-making processes in Western societies. While Western societies value expert opinion, there's a willful ignorance about experts staying in their lane, which results in ironic situations where structurally, sometimes it's the least qualified person who ends up being a decision maker. And I want to give you an example from my fieldwork. So I'm a medical anthropologist, and a lot of my research has involved fieldwork in hospitals to help understand health systems and decision-making practices in healthcare. One day, during fieldwork in a maternity unit of a hospital, I was standing by the reception desk in antenatal clinic, the clinic where pregnant women came for their pregnancy checkups. One of the obstetricians, who was often nicknamed Dr. God because of his opinion of his own abilities, stormed out of his clinic room, slammed a file down on the desk and stomped off, muttering, "She has no idea." Now, the midwife who'd been with him in the consulting room at the time explained to me that the woman he'd just seen had a test result come back that confirmed the child she was carrying was a Down syndrome baby. While what is supposed to happen in Australia is that advice should then be given by a trained genetic counsellor, in reality, the people that women and their families most often receive advice from is their doctor, either their GP or obstetrician. The woman in this case had decided to proceed with her pregnancy. Dr. God thought it was the wrong decision and was furious that the woman wouldn't take his advice, which was to terminate the pregnancy. The midwife said, "You know the woman who apparently has no idea? She works in special ed with Down syndrome kids." So she was, in fact, very well informed about what it means to have a Down syndrome child. Now, I suggest that doctors are the absolute last people who should ever be advising women and their families about Down syndrome. A medical approach to Down syndrome is very much a deficit approach, where the medical focus is on what can't be done. So from a medical perspective, aside from particular health conditions such as vulnerability to heart disease, Down syndrome typically means a child will have a lower measurable IQ than average and is unlikely to be an academic high achiever. There's no mention of the skills and the abilities and the emotional superpowers of Down syndrome kids. Now, to get to the stage of being a GP or being an obstetrician, a doctor has to have had ridiculously high marks at school, which means they're likely to have spent all of their school years being identified as one of the bright kids. They have had to undertake 6 intense years of medical school and then 4 to 6 years of specialist training. For most doctors, their primary identifying characteristic is their intelligence. Now, while there may be some exceptions, I suggest that as a generalisation, doctors are most probably the least qualified people in our society to advise on the quality of life for a Down syndrome person, as they are among the least able people to be able to imagine what life might be like for people who are defined by something other than their intelligence. Now, there are so many examples in Western industrialised societies where some of the least qualified people are in decision-making positions. I suggest areas of food growing and food supply have many similar examples. People from urban areas with very little knowledge of food production are often responsible for developing policy that impacts our entire food system. Many decisions about farming and food growing are made either by descendants of colonisers who had stolen land and dispossessed its inhabitants, or people who have subsequently purchased land that was the proceeds of that land theft. There's very little food produced in Australia on land that is inhabited by the people who have the best knowledge of living sustainably on this country. There are many things that Anglo-Australians are taught to not know about relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. We're taught incorrect versions of history in our schools. We are fed damaging and distorted stereotypes in our media. Australians are constantly taught in them and us language, with the us being an Anglo-Australian white, heteronormative, ableist, non-Indigenous self, juxtaposed against migrant, Indigenous, queer, disabled others. We are taught how to be exclusive rather than how to be inclusive. Our capacities for connection are damaged, and we are given, in mainstream society, remarkably few tools to help us rebuild our understandings of the connections that are going to be crucial for global survival. Now, the question that I want to finish on today is one that I'm personally grappling with at the moment. As somebody who wants to unlearn how to not know, as someone who was raised as an Anglo-Australian on stolen land, how can I conduct myself ethically as a permaculturalist on stolen land? Audre Lorde tells us that we will never dismantle the master's house by using the master's tools. By confronting the things that we are taught not to know, the learned ignorance of dominant paradigms, maybe we can learn how to decenter white perspectives and connect into other, healthier, more ethical ways of being. Hopefully we can maintain our momentum as we move forward towards the healing that needs to begin towards the healing that needs to happen to begin to address our behaviours that are contributing to climate change. Thank you very much to PermaQueer, Guy and Todd, for bringing us together, and thank you for listening to my contribution.